After I forgot the dessert at Christmas, my daughter-in-law screamed, "You're such a useless old woman." Everyone stared. I stood up and said, "Then stop calling me when you need money." What she did to me next forced me to call 911 immediately. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. My name is Viviane Montgomery. For 40 years, I was a high school English teacher, a woman who believed in the power of words to build worlds and bridge divides. I thought the story of my family was a classic, a tale of love and support. This is the story of how I discovered it was a tragedy, full of sound and fury, and how I was forced to write a final, unsparing chapter in the cold, clear language of the law. Now, let me tell you my story. The illusion of a perfect Christmas was a fragile, shimmering thing, and I was its primary and most exhausted architect. The air in my son's beautifully restored Boston Edison home was thick with the scent of roasting turkey, of pine needles from the ridiculously oversized tree, and of a tension so palpable it felt like a fifth guest at the dining table. At 68, my retirement was a far cry from the quiet literary life I had envisioned. I had imagined my days filled with classic novels, with quiet cups of tea, with the gentle scholarly pursuit of my own long-deferred interests. Instead, my days were filled with the relentless and entirely uncompensated labor of propping up the beautiful, fraudulent life of my son and his wife. My daughter-in-law, Brandy, was the director of this grand, domestic production. A freelance graphic designer with a taste for luxury that far outstripped her income, she was a woman who was constantly, relentlessly curating her own life for an imaginary audience on social media. Her home was not a place to be lived in. It was a stage, a backdrop for her carefully art-directed photographs of a life of effortless, effluent grace. And I, her live-in mother-in-law, was the unpaid and largely invisible stagehand. This Christmas, like all the holidays before it, was a masterclass in her particular brand of performative perfection. The decorations were a symphony of tasteful, minimalist elegance, a look she had copied from a high-end design magazine. The table was set with china I knew they couldn't afford, rented for the occasion, and the meal, the glorious multi-course feast that was currently filling the house with its warm, festive aromas, had been almost entirely prepared by me. I had spent the last 3 days in her gleaming, state-of-the-art kitchen, a space that felt more like a laboratory than a place of nourishment, following her precise and often contradictory instructions. I had brined the turkey, I had peeled the potatoes, I had chopped the vegetables. I had been the silent, efficient engine in the beautiful sputtering machine of her domestic fantasy. My son, Keith, was the nervous, perpetually anxious buffer between his wife's volatile ambition and my own quiet and increasingly weary endurance. A city planner for the Detroit Parks Department, he was a good, gentle man, a man who loved both his mother and his wife, and who had therefore chosen a life of strategic, miserable neutrality. He moved through the house with the quiet, apologetic shuffle of a man who was constantly trying to put out small fires, to smooth over the rough, sharp edges of his wife's personality. He saw her ambition as a sign of her passion, her explosive temper as a sign of her creative, artistic soul. He was a master of the art of the excuse, the gentle reframing of his wife's cruelty into something more palatable. The financial strain in their lives was a constant, unspoken presence, a ghost at their perfectly set table. Brandy's freelance business was, I knew, a failing enterprise, a hobby that cost more than it earned. Keith's salary as a city planner was respectable, but it was not nearly enough to fund the lavish high-end lifestyle that Brandy believed was her birthright. And so they had come to rely on a third secret source of income, me. My pension, the modest but stable fruit of 40 years of teaching, had become their emergency fund, their slush fund, their safety net. Just last month it had been a frantic, tearful call from Keith. The property taxes were due and they were short. $1,500 short. Could I possibly help? It was, he had assured me, a one-time emergency, a temporary cash flow problem. I had, of course, transferred the money, draining my own small savings account to do so. I knew, with a quiet, soul-crushing certainty, that it was not alone. It was a tribute, a payment I had to make to maintain my fragile, tenuous place in their family. And so, on this Christmas morning, as I basted the turkey and mashed the potatoes, I was not just the cook, I was the primary sponsor of the entire beautiful and utterly fraudulent event. The performance kicked into high gear with the arrival of the other guests. Brandy's parents, the Wallaces. They were a quiet, older couple, a pair of gentle, weary souls who seemed to have been permanently exhausted by the sheer, overwhelming force of their own daughter's personality. Mr. Wallace was a small, stooped man with a kind, sad smile. Mrs. Wallace was a woman who communicated primarily through a series of small, anxious sighs. They were the silent, captive audience for their daughter's grand theatrical production of A Perfect Family Life. The moment they stepped through the door, Brandy transformed. The sharp, critical taskmaster who had been barking orders at me in the kitchen all morning was gone, replaced by a vision of warm, effusive, and utterly devoted daughterly love. She hugged her parents, her voice a silken, gushing river of affection. She paraded her own beautiful daughter, my granddaughter, Layla, in front of them, a perfect 8-year-old doll in a velvet Christmas dress. She pointed out the elegant decorations, the beautiful table setting, the delicious aromas wafting from the kitchen, taking full and utterly shameless credit for every single detail. And my son Keith played his part to perfection. He was the doting, successful husband, the proud, happy father, the man who had provided all of this for his beautiful, talented wife. He laughed at her jokes, he praised her impeccable taste, he looked at her with a kind of blind, worshipful adoration that was both touching and profoundly tragically sad. I, meanwhile, continued in my role as the silent, efficient, and largely invisible servant. I brought out the appetizers, I poured the wine, I cleared the empty glasses. Brandy would occasionally acknowledge my presence with a sharp, whispered command. "Mom, the napkins need to be refolded. Vivian, Mr. Wallace needs another drink." She used my first name in front of her parents, a subtle but effective way of demoting me from family matriarch to hired help. I could see the discomfort in Mrs. Wallace's eyes. She was a woman of my own generation, a woman who understood the unspoken rules of family, of respect for one's elders. She would catch my eye, a small, apologetic, and utterly helpless smile on her lips. She was a silent witness to my humiliation, but she was too intimidated by her own formidable daughter to intervene. She was a fellow prisoner in the beautiful, suffocating jail of Brandy's perfect Christmas. The only source of genuine, uncomplicated warmth in that entire beautiful and emotionally bankrupt house was my granddaughter, Layla. She was a sweet, sensitive child, with her father's kind eyes and a quiet, watchful nature that was far too old for her 8 years. She would follow me into the kitchen, her small hand slipping into mine, her presence a silent, comforting anchor in the swirling chaos of the day. "Nana," she would whisper, her voice a small secret thing. "Mommy is being bossy today." I would just smile and squeeze her hand, my heart aching with a love so fierce it was a physical pain. She was the reason I endured all of this. She was the reason I tolerated Brandy's cruelty, the reason I accepted Keith's cowardice. For her, for this beautiful, innocent child, I would have walked through fire, and in a way, I suppose, I was. The fire of my daughter-in-law's ambition, of my son's weakness, of my own slow and inexorable erasure. Dinner was, by all accounts, a resounding success. The turkey was moist, the potatoes were fluffy, the conversation, at least on the surface, was light and festive. I, of course, did not get to enjoy much of it. I was a constant blur of motion, shuttling back and forth between the kitchen and the dining room, refilling water glasses, replenishing side dishes, ensuring that the entire elaborate production went off without a hitch. I ate my own meal in hurried, stolen bites, standing over the kitchen sink, my back aching, my feet throbbing, but I did it with a quiet, uncomplaining sense of duty. This was my role. This was my contribution. And if it made my son and my granddaughter happy, then it was a small price to pay. As the main course was finally cleared, as the guests leaned back in their chairs, their faces flushed with wine and good food, Brandy stood up, a wine glass in her hand. She tapped it with a fork, the clear, ringing sound silencing the cheerful chatter. And now she announced, her voice a grand theatrical flourish. For the grand finale, my mother-in-law Vivian has prepared her famous secret recipe sweet potato pie. A murmur of appreciative, anticipatory excitement went around the table. My sweet potato pie was indeed famous, a legendary confection that was the traditional and much beloved centerpiece of our family's holiday meals. And it was in that moment, in that sudden, silent, and expectant hush, that a wave of pure cold and undiluted horror washed over me. In the chaos of the last 3 days, in the relentless, exhausting whirlwind of cooking a meal for 12 people, in the constant, stressful dance of navigating my daughter-in-law's volatile moods, I had forgotten the one single solitary task that had been officially assigned to me. The sweet potato pie, in its raw, unbaked, and entirely useless state, was sitting on my own kitchen counter 10 miles away, a silent, mocking testament to my own human and utterly unforgivable fallibility. The silence that followed Brandy's grand announcement stretched for an eternity. Every eye at the table was on me, their faces a mixture of happy, hungry anticipation. My own face, I am sure, was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. My mind went completely, utterly blank. I could feel a hot, prickling flush creep up my neck and spread across my cheeks. I, Vivian Montgomery, a woman who had spent her life in a state of quiet, competent control, a woman who had juggled the complex life-and-death logistics of a NICU for 40 years, had made a mistake, a simple, stupid, and in this particular context, catastrophic mistake. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat had gone completely desert dry. It was Keith, my son, who finally broke the spell. "Mom," he said, his voice a gentle, prodding question. "The pie." And then, the words finally came. A weak, pathetic, and utterly inadequate torrent of apology. I'm so sorry," I stammered, my voice a hoarse, unfamiliar whisper. In all the confusion of the last few days, I left it at my house. On the counter, unbaked. The effect of my confession on the room was immediate and profound. The festive, cheerful atmosphere which I had worked so hard to create evaporated in an instant, replaced by a sudden awkward and deeply uncomfortable silence. Miss Wallace, Brandy's mother, let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh of pure, unadulterated sympathy. Mr. Wallace just stared at his empty plate, his face a mask of pained embarrassment. Keith's face, which had been a picture of happy holiday contentment, now crumpled into a look of profound, and I suspected deeply familiar dread. He knew what was coming. We all knew what was coming. But it was Brandy's reaction that was the most terrifying. Her face, which had been a radiant, smiling mask of the perfect hostess, seemed to freeze. The smile did not fade. It solidified, becoming a hard, brittle, and utterly terrifying rictus of pure, unadulterated rage. Her eyes, which had been sparkling with a festive holiday cheer, now turned into two cold, dead chips of black ice. She was a beautiful, terrifying Gorgon, and her gaze was turning the entire happy Christmas dinner to stone. She did not speak, not at first. She just stared at me, her eyes boring into me, a silent, venomous accusation that was more powerful than any shouted curse. And then, when the silence had become so thick, so heavy that it was almost impossible to breathe, she spoke. Her voice was not a shout, it was a low, vicious, and utterly contemptuous hiss, a sound that was so full of a long simmering hatred that it seemed to poison the very air in the room. "You had one job," she said, her voice a low, trembling murmur of pure, unadulterated fury. "One job. I did everything else. I planned the menu. I bought the groceries. I decorated the house. I did everything, and all you had to do, the one single solitary thing you had to do, was make a stupid pie." She paused, her chest heaving with a rage that was so profound, so absolute, that it seemed to be a physical thing, a living, breathing monster that was about to break free from its cage. And then, her voice, no longer a hiss, rose to a shrill, ugly, and utterly unrestrained shriek. A sound that shattered the last fragile remnants of our perfect, fraudulent Christmas. "You can't even do that. You're such a useless old woman." The words, so ugly, so cruel, so profoundly, fundamentally disrespectful, hung in the air, a toxic, radioactive cloud that settled over the stunned, silent dining table. Useless. The word was a physical blow, a sharp, stinging slap to my soul. I, Vivian Montgomery, who had spent the last 72 hours as an unpaid, unthanked, and largely invisible servant in her home, was useless. The public nature of the humiliation was a new and particularly vicious form of torture. It was not just an insult, it was a public shaming, a deliberate, calculated act of degradation, performed in front of an audience of her own parents. I could feel their eyes on me, their faces a mixture of pity and horrified embarrassment. I saw my granddaughter, Layla, her small, beautiful face, which had been so full of a happy, holiday excitement just moments before, now crumple into a mask of pure, terrified confusion. Her lower lip began to tremble, and her eyes, wide and dark, filled with tears. She was watching her own mother, her role model, her queen, transform into a screaming, ugly monster, and the sight was, I knew, a wound that would not easily heal. But it was my own son's reaction that was the final, and most devastating blow. In that moment of profound, public humiliation, my eyes, filled with a desperate, pleading hope, flew to him, my only child, my Keith. Surely he would not let this stand. Surely he would not allow his wife to speak to his own mother in such a monstrous, unforgivable way. He would say something, he would defend me. He would tell her she had gone too far. He had to. He was a good man, he was my son. He met my gaze across the table. His face was pale. His eyes wide with a shame so profound, so absolute, that it was a physical thing. But it was not shame for his wife's behavior. It was shame for my own. He looked from my face to his wife's, which was now a mask of triumphant, righteous fury. And then he did the one thing, the only thing that could have possibly been more painful than her shouted insults. He did nothing, he just stared down at his empty plate. His hands clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists in his lap. His shoulders hunched in a gesture of utter, complete, and cowardly surrender. His silence was not a neutral act. It was a verdict. It was a full, unqualified endorsement of his wife's cruelty. His silence was a betrayal more profound, more cutting, more unforgivable than any shouted curse. Her words were the ravings of a bitter, unhappy woman. But his silence was the sound of my own son, choosing his tormentor over his mother. It was the sound of my heart, breaking. A strange and entirely unfamiliar sensation began to spread through my body. It was a feeling that started as a slow, cold burn in the pit of my stomach and radiated outwards. A wave of pure, unadulterated, and utterly liberating rage. The woman who had sat down at that table, the quiet, patient, and endlessly accommodating Viviane, the woman who had spent a lifetime biting her tongue, keeping the peace, and absorbing the small daily insults of her daughter-in-law for the sake of a fragile and entirely illusory family harmony, was gone. She had died, right there in the wreckage of her son's cowardice. And in her place, a new woman was born. A woman who was done being silent. A woman who was done being invisible. A woman who was done being useless. I had been a teacher for 40 years. I had stood in front of classrooms, filled with unruly, disrespectful teenagers, and I had, with the quiet, unshakable force of my own personal authority, commanded their respect. I had forgotten what that felt like. I had forgotten the power of my own voice. And in that moment, as I looked at the hateful, triumphant face of my daughter-in-law and the pathetic, defeated face of my own son, I decided it was time to remind them. It was time for one final and unforgettable lesson. I slowly, deliberately, rose to my feet. My movement was not the frail, uncertain movement of a useless old woman. It was the slow, steady, and utterly confident movement of a woman who was completely and totally in command of herself. The sudden, unexpected action sent a fresh ripple of shock through the stunned, silent room. Every eye was on me. I smoothed the lines of my simple, elegant dress, a quiet, unconscious gesture of a woman preparing for battle. I did not look at the horrified, embarrassed faces of Brandy's parents. I did not look at my granddaughter, whose small, tear-streaked face was a silent, heartbreaking testament to the damage that had just been done. I looked only at my son, and at the woman who had so thoroughly and so completely conquered him. I let the silence stretch, letting the weight of their own, monstrous behavior settle into the room, and then I spoke. My voice was not a shout. It was not a whisper. It was the calm, clear, and utterly authoritative voice of a teacher, a voice that was accustomed to being listened to, a voice that cut through the thick, toxic silence of the room like a razor. "You are right, Brandy," I said, my voice as cool and as crisp as the winter air outside. "I am useless." I paused, letting the unexpected agreement hang in the air for a moment, and then I delivered the final, devastating line of my lesson. "Then stop calling me when you need money." The effect of my words on the room was immediate and profound. It was as if I had just detonated a small, silent, but incredibly powerful bomb. The statement was not an insult. It was a fact, a cold, hard, and utterly undeniable fact, that lay at the very heart of our entire dysfunctional relationship. I had just in a single quiet sentence, exposed the ugly transactional truth that lay beneath the beautiful fraudulent surface of their lives. I had reminded them, and more importantly, I had reminded her parents that my uselessness was in fact the very foundation upon which their entire precarious financial world was built. The color drained from Brandy's face. Her mask of triumphant, righteous fury was replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated, and utterly panicked shock. She had been publicly and irrefutably exposed as a hypocrite, a parasite, a woman who would curse the very hand that fed her. Her parents, the Wallaces, who had been a study in pained, embarrassed silence, now looked at their daughter with a new and deeply unsettling expression. It was a look of profound and dawning shame. And my son, my dear cowardly Keith, finally looked up from his plate. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He was not just ashamed of his wife, he was terrified of her. He knew better than anyone the precarious and often desperate state of their finances. He knew that my quiet, regular infusions of cash were the only thing that was keeping their beautiful, fragile world from shattering into a million pieces. And he knew that I had just, with a single quiet sentence, threatened to turn off the tap. The illusion of their happy, successful, and independent life had just been ripped to shreds, and they were now exposed in front of their entire captive audience, for what they truly were, two grown, able-bodied adults, who were financially dependent on the useless old woman they so openly, and so cruelly despised. My quiet, factual statement was the spark that ignited the inferno. For Brandy, a woman whose entire identity was built on a fragile, carefully constructed facade of success and independence, the public exposure of her financial hypocrisy was a wound she could not bear. It was a direct and devastating assault on the very core of her narcissistic self-image. All her insecurities, all her resentments, all her deep-seated, and I now saw, pathological rage at her own self-perceived failures, erupted in a single volcanic and utterly terrifying explosion. The mask of the civilized, sophisticated hostess did not just crack, it was obliterated, revealing the raw, primal, and terrifyingly violent creature that lay beneath. She let out a guttural scream, a sound that was not human, a sound of pure, unadulterated, and animalistic rage. And then she lunged. It was not a slow, deliberate movement. It was a sudden, explosive, and utterly uncontrolled burst of pure physical violence. She launched herself across the corner of the dining table, her hands outstretched like claws, her face a mask of such pure, murderous hatred that it will be forever seared into my memory. The beautiful, festive centerpiece, a collection of pine boughs and scented candles, was sent flying, scattering across the table in a shower of glass and wax. The entire shocking event seemed to happen in slow motion. I saw the look of pure, uncomprehending terror on my granddaughter's face. I saw Mr. Wallace, Brandy's father, a small, frail man, make a feeble, instinctive move to stand up to intervene. But he was too slow, too old, too shocked. I saw my son, my own son, who was sitting closest to me, who was in the best position to protect me, do nothing. He just sat there, his hands still clenched in his lap, his face a mask of pure, paralyzed, and utterly abject terror. He was a statue, a monument to his own unforgivable cowardice. And then she was on me. Her hands, which had been so recently engaged in the delicate, civilized act of serving a Christmas dinner, were now a weapon. She did not slap me, she did not hit me, she shoved me. A hard, brutal, and two-handed shove, directly to my chest. "You old bitch," she screamed, her voice a raw, ugly, and unrecognizable thing, her face just inches from my own, her eyes blazing with a light that was truly, certifiably insane. The force of the shove was stunning. I was a 68-year-old woman, and she was a strong, enraged woman in her late 30s. I had no chance. I stumbled backward, my arms flailing, my feet tangling in the legs of the dining chair behind me. For a moment I was suspended in a state of pure, weightless terror, my world a blur of overturned glasses, shocked faces, and the single terrible screaming face of my daughter-in-law. And then I fell. I crashed down onto the hard, polished, and unforgiving hardwood floor, the impact a brutal, jarring explosion of pure physical pain. My hip, my old arthritic hip, took the brunt of the fall, and a sharp, searing, and white-hot pain shot through my entire body, a pain so intense that it momentarily stole the breath from my lungs. A collective, horrified gasp filled the room, and then it was replaced by a new, even more terrible sound. The sound of my granddaughter, Layla, screaming. A high-pitched, terrified, and continuous scream. The sound of a child who has just witnessed a piece of the world, a piece of her own, safe and predictable world, break in a way that can never ever be repaired. I lay on the floor, the world a dizzying, pain-filled blur, the screams of my granddaughter a sharp, piercing counterpoint to the dull, throbbing agony in my hip. I looked up, and through a haze of pain and shock I saw the scene above me, a grotesque, surreal tableau of a Christmas dinner gone horribly, irrevocably wrong. Brandy was standing over me, her chest heaving, her face flushed with a triumphant, adrenaline-fueled rage. Keith was finally on his feet, but he was not rushing to my side. He was trying to restrain his wife, his arms wrapped around her, his voice a low, pleading, and utterly pathetic murmur. "Brandy, baby, stop. Please. You're scaring Layla." He was not concerned about his mother, who was lying, possibly seriously injured, on his dining room floor. He was concerned about his wife's emotional state, about the effect of her violence on their child. Even in this moment of absolute, catastrophic crisis. His first and only instinct was to manage her, to placate her, to soothe the savage beast he had so foolishly, and so willingly married. Brandy's parents, the Wallaces, were a study in horrified, helpless paralysis. They were frozen in their chairs, their faces a mask of pure unadulterated shock and shame. They were watching their own personal and deeply private family horror story play out in front of a new and deeply unwilling audience. And in that moment, as I lay on the cold hard floor, a victim of a brutal, unprovoked and entirely predictable assault, something inside me, something that had been dormant for a very long time, finally and irrevocably, snapped. It was the last fragile thread of my own personal and deeply ingrained social contract. The contract that says you do not air your family's dirty laundry in public. The contract that says you protect the family, even when the family is trying to destroy you. The contract that says you suffer in silence, that you keep the peace, that you absorb the pain for the sake of a fragile and entirely illusory family harmony. The contract was now null and void. This was not a family argument anymore. This was not a drama. This was a crime, a physical, violent, and legally prosecutable crime. And I, Vivian Montgomery, a respectable, law-abiding and now physically assaulted, senior citizen, was the victim. The teacher in me, the woman who had spent her life enforcing the rules of a civilized society, took over. The mother, the grandmother, the endlessly forgiving and endlessly foolish matriarch was gone, and in her place was a citizen who knew her rights, a citizen who was about to exercise them. With a trembling, pain-filled hand, I reached into the pocket of my dress. My cell phone was still there, a small, hard and wonderfully solid piece of modern technology. My fingers, clumsy with shock and pain, fumbled with the screen. I did not call a friend. I did not call a relative. I did not call for help from the very people who had just proven themselves to be the source of the danger. I dialed the 3 numbers that are the last, and sometimes the only, resort of the civilized. I dialed 911. The phone was on speaker. My hand was shaking too badly to hold it to my ear. The voice of the dispatcher, a calm, professional and wonderfully blessedly anonymous woman, filled the sudden, shocked silence of the room. 911, what is your emergency? My own voice when I spoke was a weak, trembling but surprisingly steady thing. Hello? I said, my voice cutting through the sound of my granddaughter's continued, hysterical sobs. I need the police. My name is Vivian Montgomery. I'm at 1204 Edison Avenue, and I've just been assaulted by my daughter-in-law. The effect of my words on the room was immediate and profound. It was as if I had just pulled the pin on a grenade. The chaotic, hysterical energy of the room was suddenly frozen, replaced by a new and even more terrifying silence. The sound of my own calm and rational voice speaking to an outside official authority had shattered the last fragile remnants of their private, dysfunctional world. I had just invited the real world, the world of laws and consequences, into their beautiful, fraudulent, and now criminal home. Keith's face, which had been a mask of panicked, placating concern for his wife, now crumpled into a look of pure, unadulterated horror. He finally understood. This was not something he could smooth over. This was not something he could manage. This was real. Brandy, who had been struggling against his weak, ineffectual grasp, suddenly went still. The rage in her eyes was replaced by a new and far more potent emotion, fear. A cold, hard, and dawning fear of a consequence she had never in her entitled life been forced to face. The police. She had not just assaulted a useless old woman. She had assaulted a citizen, and that citizen had just, with a few calm and devastatingly effective words, called in the cavalry. The 10 minutes between my 911 call and the arrival of the police were the longest and most surreal of my life. The idyllic Christmas scene had descended into a state of chaotic suspended animation. I remained on the floor, a sharp searing pain in my hip making it impossible for me to move. The initial shocked paralysis of the other guests had broken, and the room was now a flurry of panicked, ineffectual activity. Brandy's mother, Mrs. Wallace, had finally been jolted out of her stupor and was now kneeling beside me, her face a mask of tearful, horrified apology. "Oh, Vivian," she sobbed, her hands fluttering uselessly around me. "I'm so sorry, I don't know what to say. She's just been under a lot of stress." Her husband, Miss Wallace, was trying with a kind of pathetic paternal authority to calm his hysterical and now utterly terrified daughter. Brandy was pacing the dining room like a caged animal, a torrent of screamed threats, of sobbed apologies, of a desperate, incoherent rage pouring out of her. "She's lying," she shrieked, her finger pointing at me, the woman who was still lying injured on the floor. "She fell. She's a clumsy, senile old woman. And she fell. She's trying to ruin my life. And my son, my dear, cowardly Keith, was trying to do what he always did, manage the unmanageable. He was fluttering between his wife and me, his face a pale, sweaty mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Mom, please, he begged, his voice a low, desperate whisper. Hang up the phone. Tell them it was a mistake. We can handle this as a family. Handle this as a family." The phrase, which had once been a source of comfort, of security, now sounded like a threat. The family was the source of the problem. The family was the source of the danger. The family was the disease. And I had just, with a single desperate and life-altering phone call, summoned the cure. And then, the cure arrived. The serene, holiday atmosphere of the quiet, historic neighborhood was shattered by the sudden, jarring and wonderfully blessedly official sound of a police siren. A pair of flashing blue and red lights painted the walls of the dining room in a chaotic, strobing dance of red and blue. A moment later there was a firm, authoritative knock at the front door. The sound, so normal, so everyday, was, in this context, the sound of doom, the sound of a world of consequences, arriving on their doorstep. The arrival of Officer Miller was like the introduction of a new and infinitely more powerful chemical agent into a volatile, unstable compound. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man in his 40s, his face calm, professional, and utterly unreadable. His presence, in his crisp blue uniform, was a sudden, shocking injection of external and absolute authority into the hot, messy, and deeply private chaos of our family drama. The moment he stepped into the dining room, the chaos ceased. Brandy's hysterical shrieks subsided into a series of low, angry sobs. Keith's frantic, panicked fluttering stopped. Even my granddaughter, Layla, who had been weeping in a corner, fell silent, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Officer Miller's gaze swept over the scene, his experienced professional eye taking in every detail in an instant. He saw the overturned centerpiece, the shattered glass, the terrified, tear-streaked faces of the guests, and he saw me, a 68-year-old woman, still lying on the floor, my face a mask of pain. His expression did not change, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hardening, a shift from professional neutrality to a more focused, and I suspected, more protective, resolve. He professionally and calmly took control of the scene. He directed his partner to take Keith and Brandy into the living room, to separate them to get their side of the story, and he knelt beside me, his movements slow, gentle and reassuring. "Mom," he said, his voice a calm, steady and wonderfully blessedly sane sound in a room that had been filled with madness. "My name is Officer Miller. Can you tell me what happened?" And so I did. I told him my story, not the long, complicated and emotionally messy story of my life with my son and his wife, but the short, simple and legally relevant story of the last 10 minutes. I told him about the argument. I told him about the verbal abuse, and I told him, my voice clear and steady despite the pain, about the physical assault. I described with the cool, factual precision of an English teacher, the two-handed shove, the fall, the searing pain in my hip. I was not a hysterical, emotional victim. I was a credible, articulate witness, providing a clear and concise account of a crime. And as I spoke, I could see in the small, almost imperceptible nods of Officer Miller's head that he believed me. My story was then, to my surprise, corroborated by the most unlikely of sources. Officer Miller's partner came back into the dining room, a small black notebook in his hand. He had just finished taking the statements of Brandy's parents, the Wallaces, and they, to their eternal credit, had told the truth. Shaken, tearful, and deeply, profoundly ashamed of their own daughter, they had confirmed every single detail of my account. They had described their daughter's verbal explosion. They had described the lunge across the table, and they had described in their own, horrified and deeply reluctant words, the physical shove that had sent me crashing to the floor. They were not just witnesses, they were the prosecution's star witnesses. They were two respectable elderly people, and they were testifying against their own child. The case, which had been strong, was now a fortress. It was my word, the word of a respectable retired teacher, and the physical evidence of my own, bruised and aching body against the word of a hysterical and now demonstrably violent woman, and it was corroborated by her own, horrified and deeply ashamed parents. There was no room for doubt, there was no room for interpretation. There was only the cold, hard, and inescapable truth. The final inevitable act of this Christmas tragedy was swift and absolute. Officer Miller spoke into his radio, his voice a low professional murmur. He then stood up and walked into the living room, where Brandy was still weeping, and where Keith was still trying, with a kind of pathetic desperate futility, to calm her down. I could not see them, but I could hear everything. I heard Officer Miller's calm, steady voice, reading Brandy her Miranda rights. I heard the sudden shocked silence, followed by a fresh and even more hysterical outburst of screamed denials and sobbing protest from Brandy. And then I heard the single most satisfying sound of my entire long and difficult life. I heard the sharp, metallic, and utterly final click of the handcuffs snapping shut around my daughter-in-law's wrists. The surreal and deeply satisfying scene unfolded in a series of stark, unforgettable images. I saw Brandy being led out of her own beautiful and now desecrated home, her hands cuffed behind her back, her beautiful expensive Christmas dress a prisoner's uniform. I saw the flashing lights of the patrol car, painting the faces of the curious, scandalized neighbors who had begun to gather on their lawns, in a chaotic strobing dance of red and blue. And I saw my son, my dear, foolish, and now utterly broken son, standing on his own front porch, his face a mask of such shattered and absolute devastation, that a small and I suspect final part of my own maternal heart broke with it. The paramedics arrived a few minutes later, their presence a calm, efficient, and wonderfully blessedly normal intrusion into the surreal, nightmarish landscape of my Christmas day. They were kind, gentle, and professional. They examined my hip, their touch sure and steady, and they told me, with a quiet, professional gravity, that it was likely broken. They carefully and with a practiced, gentle precision, loaded me onto a stretcher and carried me out of the house, out of the wreckage of my own former life. As they were wheeling me towards the ambulance, I saw Keith. He was standing on the porch, a lone, pathetic figure in the harsh, flashing lights of the patrol car. He was trying to comfort Layla, who was weeping in his arms, her small body shaking with a grief and a terror that no 8-year-old should ever have to experience. He looked at me, his eyes a swirling vortex of shame, of grief, of a dawning, horrified comprehension of the full and absolute extent of his own catastrophic failure as a son, as a husband, and as a man. He had not protected his mother. He had not controlled his wife. And in his weakness, in his cowardice, he had allowed his entire beautiful and fraudulent world to be utterly and completely destroyed. He had lost everything. His wife was in the back of a police car, his mother was in the back of an ambulance, and his daughter's happy, innocent, and carefree childhood had just been murdered, right in front of his eyes. I was in pain, a deep physical pain in my hip, and a deeper, more profound, and I suspected, more permanent, pain in my heart. But as the ambulance doors closed, shutting out the sight of my son's ruined face, I felt a new, and entirely unfamiliar sensation. It was a sense of peace, a quiet, profound, and utterly final sense of a peace that I had not known was possible. I had lost a family, I had lost the beautiful, and I now saw, entirely illusory dream of a happy, peaceful, and loving old age. But in that moment of terrible public and necessary destruction, I had reclaimed something far more valuable. I had reclaimed myself. I had chosen my own personal safety, my own personal dignity, my own personal truth, over the violent and fraudulent illusion of a happy family. And in that choice, in that single life-altering and utterly, completely and finally, selfish act, I had at last, and against all odds, set myself free. Now I'm curious about you who have listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever had to make the difficult choice to break the silence, to choose your own well-being over the illusion of family peace? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching.